You will find his weaknesses, Margaret, or you will find yourself in the poorhouse alongside the rest of us. Margaret Aldous, 26, widowed 11 months and reduced to the single black gown she had turned twice already, said nothing in reply. Her uncle's letter lay open on the small writing desk of the room she had been given at Harrogate Hall, a room 3 doors from the housekeeper's, which told her precisely what the household had been informed to think of her: a poor relation, a companion to no one in particular, a woman brought in on the strength of a family name that had once meant something and now meant only debt, folded twice over and creased at the corners from handling. She had been at the hall 4 days. She had catalogued in that time the number of times the Duke of Ravensmere had smiled, none; the hour he rose, 5:30, before even the scullery maids had lit the kitchen fires, and the fact that he took his coffee black and read his correspondence standing, as though sitting to receive bad news might grant it too much ceremony. She had catalogued nothing of use to her uncle. She had catalogued instead the particular way his Grace's jaw tightened when a certain steward's name was mentioned at breakfast, and the manner in which he answered every question about the estate with 3 times the detail anyone required, as if precision were the only language in which he trusted himself to be understood. She did not know what to do with the fact that she had noticed these things at all, nor with the small, uncomfortable warmth that had begun, against her own instruction to herself, to attach itself to the noticing. She was not, properly speaking, a spy. She would not have called herself that, not even in the privacy of her own mind, where the words sat like a stone she kept turning over and setting down again, never quite willing to hold it long enough to feel its full weight. She was a poor widow whose family had run out of every other resource and possessed one relation, however distant, however humiliated by the connection, inside the household of the coldest, richest, most talked-of duke in 3 counties. Her uncle wanted debts. He wanted scandal, or the shape of one, something that might be pressed into service against a man who held the mortgage on the last unmortgaged acre the Aldous family still possessed. He wanted her to make herself small and useful and forgettable, and to listen, and to report, and to feel nothing while she did it. What no one in that house yet understood was that Margaret Aldous had spent 11 months of widowhood learning to survive on nothing but her own attention, and attention, once trained to that pitch, does not switch itself off simply because the object of it has become inconvenient to notice. The Duke of Ravensmere, Julian Vane, 31, a man built along severe economical lines, tall in the manner of someone who had learned young to make himself smaller in every room that mattered, and had since abandoned the habit entirely in favor of an armor of total self-possession, did not know he was being observed for a purpose. He knew only that his aunt, Lady Fenwick, had installed a poor cousin of some distant connection in the East Wing as a companion to no one in particular, on the grounds that the house wanted a settling influence after the departure of his previous housekeeper's assistant, and he had not troubled himself to inquire further, because he troubled himself with very little that was not the estate's ledgers, the estate's tenants, or the singular, exhausting business of being a duke that his father had trained into him before Julian was old enough to know there had ever been another way to be a boy. His father, the late Duke, had been a man who assessed rather than loved. Julian had learned arithmetic before he had learned affection, had learned the value of land before he had learned the value of his own preferences, and had concluded somewhere around his 15th year that the safest posture for a future duke was to want as little as possible, since wanting things had only ever been used, in his father's house, as a lever against him. He had carried that conclusion into manhood with the thoroughness of a man completing an inheritance. He did not know, in the ordinary run of his days, that he was lonely. He knew only that his house was well run, his tenants were provided for, and his correspondence was answered promptly. and he had trained himself over 15 years not to ask whether any of it added up to a life. He noticed her on the fifth day, not by design. She was in the long gallery at an hour when the house believed itself asleep, standing before the portrait of his grandmother with an expression he could not immediately place. Not admiration, not the polite, empty appreciation his guests performed before the family pictures as a kind of social currency, but something closer to recognition, as though she had found, in the old duchess's painted face, a woman she might have liked to speak with had circumstance allowed it. "You are up early, Mrs. Aldous." He had not meant to speak. The words simply arrived, as words rarely did with him, and he found himself faintly startled by his own voice in the empty gallery. She did not startle at the sound of him. He noted that, filed it somewhere he did not yet understand he was keeping a file at all. She only turned, unhurried, and inclined her head with the precise, economical courtesy of a woman who had been taught manners before she had been taught to need them for her own protection. "I find the house quieter before it wakes, Your Grace. I have never required much sleep." "Nor I." He had not intended to say that, either. It was, he would reflect later, the first unguarded sentence he had spoken to another living soul in longer than he cared to calculate. "Then we are both of us keeping the same early hours, for reasons neither of us intends to discuss," she said, and there was, beneath the composure, the faintest trace of dry amusement, not flirtation, not the practiced volleys of the season's marriage market to which Julian had made himself entirely deaf a decade ago, but something plainer and more dangerous. Recognition between two people who had each, independently, built a fortress out of waking early enough that no one else could witness the labor of holding themselves together. It would be many weeks before either of them understood what had truly passed between them in that gallery at 5:30 in the morning. She wrote to her uncle that night, by candlelight, her hand steadier than her conscience. "He rises before dawn and speaks little. There is nothing yet to report." She did not write of the gallery. She told herself this was because there was nothing in it worth reporting. A duke had spoken perhaps 20 words to her, that was all. 20 words did not constitute intelligence, and did not examine too closely why the omission had felt, as she sealed the letter, like the first small dishonesty she had ever practiced against her own family, rather than for it. The household of Harrogate Hall, she began to learn in the weeks that followed, ran on a discipline that had nothing to do with cruelty, and everything to do with a man who had been taught, very young, that the only safe thing to be was useful. Mrs. Pruitt, the housekeeper, told her, in the manner housekeepers tell things, sideways, over the mending, never quite looking up, that His Grace had been 11 when his father died, and 31 still, in the particular way he flinched from praise, as if praise were a trap laid for softer men than he permitted himself to be. "His late father," Mrs. Pruitt said, needle moving steadily, "was not a man who loved his son. He was a man who assessed him, the way one assesses a horse or a hunting dog, for use, for value, for what return it might yield. There is a difference between assessment and love, Mrs. Aldous, and His Grace has never quite recovered from learning it so young, though he would tell you he has recovered from everything." Margaret filed this, too, in the growing ledger of things she knew about Julian Vane that her uncle would never see. She could not have said, if pressed, who she was keeping the file for anymore. By the second week, she had begun to notice things about herself that troubled her more than anything she had learned about him. She noticed that she dressed with more care on the mornings she expected to encounter him in the gallery. She noticed that she found herself composing, in idle moments, the sentences she might say to him if a subject arose that she suspected would interest him. A new agricultural method, a piece of shipping news, the fortunes of a particular canal company. And she noticed, with something closer to alarm than pleasure, that she had begun to think of these imagined conversations as a comfort rather than a strategy. Her uncle's second letter arrived at the end of that fortnight. sharper in tone than the first. You have been a month in that house and sent me nothing but a description of his sleeping habits. I did not send you there to become acquainted with a duke's breakfast preferences. Find the man's debts, his mistresses, his weaknesses. Every man of that rank has at least one, and I require it before the quarter turns, or your mother's annuity will not survive the season. She burned the letter in the grate that night, not because she meant to disobey it, but because she could not bear to keep it in the room with her, as if its presence alone might contaminate the small, guarded peace she had begun, against every instruction she had given herself to feel inside Harrowgate's walls. The turning gesture, though she would not recognize it as such until much later, when she had cause to look back and locate the precise hinge on which her whole life had swung, arrived on an ordinary Tuesday in late October, when a tenant family named Hollis lost their eldest boy to a fever the parish physician could not name, and the Duke of Ravensmere, who by every account she had gathered was a man made of ledgers and cold arithmetic, rode out himself in driving rain to sit with the grieving father until well past midnight, and told no one of it, and would have been mortified, she understood this with sudden, total clarity, to learn that she knew. She learned because she followed him, not from suspicion, from something she did not yet have a better word for than concern, though concern felt too small a word for the tightness in her chest when she had seen him ride out alone, in weather no sensible man would choose. She found him afterward in the stable yard, soaked through to the skin, unbuttoning his greatcoat with hands that were not quite steady, and she did not offer sympathy, because she had learned enough of him by then to know that sympathy, offered plainly, would only make him retreat further behind the wall he had spent 20 years constructing, stone by careful stone. Instead, she said, "The Hollis boy's mother will need help with the younger children through the winter. I can see to it, if your grace has no objection." He looked at her for a long moment in the lantern light, rain still dripping from his hair onto the collar of his ruined coat, and something in his face. She would spend weeks afterward trying to name it, and would only ever manage the word unguarded, cracked open, briefly, entirely without his permission. "Why," he said, low, almost accusing, "would that concern you?" "Because it concerns you," she said, "and you will not sleep tonight for thinking of it, and there is no reason both of us should lie awake over an arithmetic you cannot solve alone." He did not answer, but the following morning a basket of provisions was sent to the Hollis cottage, under her direction, without his name attached to it, and she understood, with the particular ache of a woman discovering a thing she had not meant to go looking for, that she had just done something no letter to her uncle would ever contain, because it belonged to no one but the two of them. Had anyone been watching closely, they might have seen that from that night forward, the Duke of Ravensmere began, in small and unannounced ways, to arrange his days around the hour Margaret Aldous took her walk in the East Garden. He would find some pretext, a letter requiring her opinion on the wording, a question about a tenant she had mentioned in passing, and appear at the garden's edge with the studied casualness of a man who did not wish to examine his own motives too closely. She, in turn, began to look forward to those pretexts with a hunger she did not permit herself to name. It was during one such walk in early November that he told her, unprompted, in the flat, careful voice of a man handing over something fragile, about the wager his father had made when Julian was 9 years old, betting a visiting marquis that the boy could recite the entire lineage of every duke in England without error, and how, when Julian had stumbled on the 11th generation, his father had not scolded him in private, but had instead, before the assembled guests, remarked that a boy who could not master his own inheritance was scarcely worth the schooling. "I did not weep," Julian said, looking out over the frost-silvered hedges rather than at her. "I had already learned, by 9, that weeping accomplished nothing but further contempt. I simply resolved never again to be found wanting in front of an audience, and I have kept that resolution for 22 years." That is not a resolution, Margaret said quietly. That is a cage you built for yourself at 9 years old and have been polishing the bars of ever since. He turned to look at her then, and for the first time since her arrival, she watched something in his composure genuinely falter, not into weakness, but into something rawer and more honest than she had yet seen him permit. No one has ever said that to me, he said. Then no one has been paying sufficient attention, she answered, and immediately wished the words back because they were truer than she had intended them to be, and she did not know how to explain to him, nor in truth to herself, precisely how much attention she had been paying, nor why. But the season was not yet finished with her, and neither was her uncle. Christmas came to Harrogate Hall, with holly wound through the great staircase, and a warmth in the house that the servants remarked had not been felt there in a decade, and Margaret allowed herself, for the length of a single evening, to imagine a life inside those walls that had nothing to do with her uncle's letters. A foolish, dangerous indulgence, and she knew it even as she permitted it. The third letter arrived on the 27th of December, and it was not a request. It was an instruction, and it was specific, in a way her uncle's previous letters had not troubled to be. He had learned, through channels Margaret did not ask about, because she suspected the answer would sicken her, that the Duke was in delicate negotiation over a canal easement that would either ruin or enrich 3 separate landholding families, the Aldises' own creditor chief among them, and her uncle wanted to know, before the negotiation closed at Michaelmas, precisely which way the Duke intended to rule, and what leverage might be brought to bear upon him before he did. You are inside that house for a reason, Margaret. Do not mistake comfort for purpose. Get me the terms of the easement, or I cannot promise what becomes of your mother's annuity, nor what becomes of the roof over her head. You have grown soft in that house. I did not send you there to grow soft. I sent you there to be useful, and useful women do not linger over a duke's smile. She read it twice, standing at her window with the Christmas greenery still fragrant in the corridor outside her door, and understood with a coldness that had nothing to do with the winter air that she had arrived at the exact crossing her uncle had always intended her to arrive at, and that there had never truly been any other destination for this arrangement. She had been sent to spy. She had, somewhere in the intervening 10 weeks, without noticing the precise hour it happened, stopped being able to do it, and had gone on pretending otherwise, to her uncle and to herself, because the alternative required a courage she had not yet located. She did not sleep that night. She walked the length of her small room until the candle guttered, turning the letter over in her mind, the way she had once turned over the word spy. And she understood, somewhere near dawn, that the family who had raised her to survive on wit and composure had also, without meaning to, raised a woman capable of recognizing when a line had finally been reached that she could not cross, whatever the cost of refusing. It was Julian who found her the following evening in the long gallery again, before the portrait of his grandmother, and who noticed, this time, that her composure had a crack in it she had not troubled to disguise. "You are unwell," he said, not a question. He had learned by then to read her the way she had once set out, so long ago it felt now, to read him. "I am considering," she said carefully, her voice not entirely steady, "whether there is a version of honesty that costs a person everything, and whether it is still owed." He was quiet for a long moment, studying her face in the candlelight, as though searching for the shape of whatever burden she was carrying. "My father used to say that a duke's word is the only true currency he possesses. That titles could be inherited and fortunes could be lost at cards, but a man's honesty was the one asset no creditor could seize. I did not believe him for many years because he did not extend that particular honesty to me. I have only recently begun to think he might have been right about the principle. even where he failed entirely at the practice. She understood, hearing it, that she was standing at the exact hinge point of her own life, and that whatever she said next would determine which version of herself she carried forward into whatever remained of it. "I was sent here," she said, the words arriving at last, plain and unadorned, stripped of every defense she might have constructed around them, "to learn the terms of your canal easement and report them to a man who would use them to ruin you or 3 other families, whichever proved more profitable to him. I have known this was my purpose since before I ever arrived at your door. I did not tell you because I did not wish it to be true, and telling you would have made it true beyond any further pretending. And I find I have run out of road on which to keep pretending." The silence that followed was the longest of her life. She watched his face for the fury she had braced herself against, the cold dismissal she had told herself on the long walk to this gallery that she deserved. It did not come. "And will you," he said finally, very quietly, "tell him now? Whatever you have learned of me these 10 weeks, will you send it?" "No," she said, and the word came out steadier than she felt. "I came to tell you instead, because I have discovered that I would rather lose everything honestly than keep anything by deceiving the one person in this house, in any house I have known these 11 months, who has never once treated me as though I were beneath his notice." He crossed the gallery to her. She would remember afterward the particular sound his boots made on the old floorboards, unhurried, deliberate, a man choosing each step with the same care he brought to every ledger he had ever balanced, and took her hand in both of his, an intimacy neither of them had permitted themselves before that hour. "Then we shall solve this together," he said, "as I have solved nothing alone in 15 years, and found it lonelier than I had the wit to notice, until a woman arrived, under false pretenses, and made the loneliness visible to me by the simple, extraordinary act of refusing to exploit it." "You are not angry." "I am many things tonight, Margaret, and anger is the smallest of them." His hand tightened briefly around hers. "You might have said nothing. You might have sent your uncle every particular he demanded, and I would never have known the difference until the easement collapsed beneath me. You chose instead the harder and more costly road, and told me so to my face, at what you believed to be the price of everything you have left. I find I cannot summon anger for a woman who has just handed me the single most honest gift anyone has offered me since my mother died." She did not weep, though the temptation was considerable. She had learned, across 11 months of widowhood and 26 years before it, that weeping rarely solved what needed solving, and there was, in any case, work yet before them both. They spent the following days, she would later think of them as the strangest and most companionable of her life, bent together over his estate papers by lamplight, restructuring the canal easement's terms so that all 3 landholding families, including her own uncle's creditor, would be treated with an equity that left no single party positioned to ruin the others. It was, Julian observed dryly, rather more work than simply letting her uncle believe he had won some advantage and then declining to honor it. But it had the considerable virtue of being honest, and he found, somewhat to his own surprise, that he preferred honest solutions now that he had a reason to. "You did not need my help with any of this," Margaret said one such evening, watching him work through a column of figures with the same absolute focus he had once brought to reciting ducal lineages at 9 years old. "You have run this estate alone for 15 years. "I did not need it," he agreed, not looking up. "I find I want it regardless, which is a distinction I am only beginning to learn the shape of." There remained, however, one further complication neither of them had anticipated, and it arrived in the form of Lady Fenwick, Julian's aunt, who had installed Margaret in the household in the first place, and who now observed, with the sharp, unforgiving eye of a woman who had buried two husbands and outmaneuvered a dozen fortune hunters in her time, that her nephew had begun to look at his poor cousin's companion the way a starving man looks at bread he does not yet believe himself permitted to eat. "You will ruin him," Lady Fenwick said to Margaret one afternoon, cornering her in the still room with the directness of a woman who had never in her life troubled to soften an observation. "Not through any wickedness of your own. I have watched you closely enough these months to know you have none. But because a duke who marries beneath his station, however honorably, invites a scrutiny that does not confine itself to kindness. The ton will ask where you came from. They will ask why a poor widow's uncle is a man known to half the moneylenders in London. They will find, eventually, whatever it is you are hiding, Mrs. Aldous, because women in your position always are hiding something. And I should like to know now whether it will destroy him before it becomes fashionable gossip over someone else's tea." Margaret did not flinch, though the words landed with the precision of a blade she had half expected for weeks. "I have already told His Grace the whole of it, my lady. There is nothing left for the ton to discover that he does not already know and has already forgiven." Lady Fenwick studied her for a long moment, something in her hard expression shifting almost imperceptibly. "Forgiven," she repeated. "That is not a word my nephew uses lightly, nor often. I have known him 31 years, and heard him extend it, perhaps, twice." She set down the jar of preserves she had been holding with the deliberate care of a woman reconsidering an entire argument mid-sentence. "Perhaps you had better tell me the whole of it as well, then, before I decide whether to help you or ruin you myself." Margaret told her, all of it, her uncle's letters, the easement, the 11 months of widowhood that had left her with nothing but her wits and a family willing to spend her like a coin. Lady Fenwick listened without interruption, her face giving away nothing until the account was finished, at which point she said, with the brisk finality of a woman who had made up her mind and did not intend to revisit the matter, "Well, you are a great deal more sense than sentiment, which is more than I can say for half the debutantes who have thrown themselves at my nephew these 10 years, hoping his title might improve upon their characters. I shall speak to no one of your uncle, provided you continue exactly as you have begun." She paused at the still-room door. "And, Mrs. Aldous, he has not looked at anyone the way he looks at you since before his father died. See that you do not waste it." It was, Margaret reflected afterward, the closest thing to a blessing she was likely to receive from that quarter, and she found she treasured it rather more than she would have predicted. The reckoning, when it came at last, came not as scandal, but as strategy. For Margaret's hidden strength, the strategic patience that had kept her alive through a widowhood with nothing to recommend it but her own composure, proved sharper in the end than her uncle's greed. She wrote to him with the plain truth that the Duke of Ravensmere knew every particular of the scheme, had already restructured the easement in terms that protected all 3 families equally, and left no leverage to be extracted by anyone, and that any further pressure exerted upon her would be met not with silence, but with the full and public weight of a duke's displeasure, declared before the very creditors upon whom her uncle's own remaining fortunes depended. Her uncle did not accept defeat quietly. A final letter arrived within the week, its tone stripped of all pretense of family feeling, threatening to take what remained of the correspondence between them, her early, cautious reports on the Duke's habits, however innocent, directly to a newspaper willing to print any hint of scandal touching a Duke's household, true or invented, provided it sold enough copies. He calculated, not without some justice, that even an untrue accusation, once printed, could not be fully unprinted, and that the mere suggestion of a spy in a duke's own gallery might cost Julian more in standing than the easement itself had ever been worth. Margaret carried the letter to Julian with hands that would not quite stop trembling, certain, for the first time since her confession in the gallery, that she had brought real ruin to his door after all. He read it once, set it down, and did something she had not expected. He laughed, briefly, without humor. "Let him print it," he said. "Let him print every word. I will stand before whatever assembly he chooses and confirm the whole of it myself, that you were sent to spy upon me, and that upon discovering the truth of your own conscience, you told me before I ever suspected it, at the certain cost of your family's goodwill, and the near certain cost of your own security. I cannot think of a scandal better calculated to recommend a woman to me, nor one more likely to make your uncle appear precisely the villain he is, once the full account is known. You would humiliate yourself to protect me." "I would tell the truth," he corrected her, "which I have found, in your company, costs rather less than I spent my whole life fearing it would." He folded the letter and set it in the fire himself. "Let it go to print. I find I am no longer a man who can be threatened with honesty." Her uncle, confronted with a plan collapsed, a threat rendered toothless, and an ally he had never accounted for, and facing the very public ruin he had hoped to visit upon others, did not trouble her again. Word reached her, months later, through a cousin's careless letter, that he had quietly settled his affairs and withdrawn from society altogether, his ambitions curdled into a silence that suited everyone, rather better than his schemes had. Margaret Aldous married Julian Vane in the early spring, in a ceremony so quiet that half the ton complained afterward of having missed it entirely, in a chapel that smelled of beeswax polish and the first lilacs of the season, forced early in the Harrogate glasshouses at his particular instruction, because he had remembered, from some offhand remark of hers months before, that lilacs were her favorite, and had said nothing of the arrangement until she saw them banked along the altar and understood, all at once, the full weight of how closely he had been listening to her all along. When he took her hand before the altar, he told her, in a voice pitched only for her, that she was the first person in his life who had ever known the worst true thing about her own conduct toward him, and told him, regardless of what it might cost her to do so, and that he had built, in the months since, an entire second understanding of what honesty and love might mean when neither was extracted by force, nor offered only in the safe currency of flattery, but given freely, at cost, by a woman who had arrived in his house as an instrument of her family's desperation and had chosen, in the end, to become something else entirely. They did not speak of spying again in all the years that followed, save once, when their eldest daughter, 6 years old and possessed of her mother's unflinching directness, asked over breakfast how her parents had first come to know one another. Margaret set down her cup and considered the question with the same care she had once brought to considering her uncle's letters. "I came to your father's house," she said at last, "to learn his secrets, child, sent by people who wished to use them against him, and I did learn a secret in the end, though not the one I was sent to find." "What secret was it, Mamma?" "That the coldest man in 3 counties," Margaret said, glancing across the table to where Julian sat, pretending not to listen, with the particular studied indifference she had long since learned meant he was listening to every word, "had already given his heart away to a stranger, under his own roof, long before either of us had the courage to say so aloud. And that some secrets, once found, are worth keeping, not for what they cost the person who holds them, but for what they are, finally, fully, allowed to become." Julian reached across the table and took her hand, as he had done in the long gallery all those years before, and said nothing at all, because there was, by then, nothing further that needed saying between them.